NATO's eastern flank leaders met today in Riga to discuss the threat from Russia and support for war-torn Ukraine.
And to discuss the Bucharest 9 summit, we're joined by our next guest, security and foreign policy expert Mark Toth is with us. Good evening.
Good evening, Claudia, Machi. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So let me start by asking for your comment on Jens Stoltenberg's words today. So the Secretary General of NATO said that the alliance has a long-term plan for Ukraine, and it's a clear message for Vladimir Putin that he simply cannot outweigh NATO. Now, I'm just wondering whether this is, some sort of a wishful thinking, because the biggest player of the NATO team, that's the US, may soon change its stance on Ukraine.
Yeah, Machi, it's a great question. Jens Stoltenberg is saying the right thing. NATO has to remain committed to not only Ukraine surviving, but Ukraine winning. We can't get into this situation where we let Putin get a win in Ukraine, because as you know, and your viewers know at TVP World, Poland and the Baltic states would be that next round that we would likely see Putin starting to go after. So, that's a given. And Stoltenberg's comments about putting together, I believe it was 41 million euros a year to support Ukraine's war effort overall is an important thing. Clearly, obviously, as I comment on frequently here on TVP World, the capabilities, the military capabilities that 41 billion euros buys is what's important. Long-range ATACMS would be great. The Taurus missile from Germany would be great. There are things that we need to be seeing happening there. But certainly, it's good to see that at least under Stoltenberg, NATO remains committed. Now, in terms of what may happen here, it's just too early to know. That election isn't until November here in the U.S., and then a change in actual administration would not be occurring until January. And I would caution viewers at this point in time, there's going to be a lot of politicking, a lot of posturing, a lot of each side trying to weaponize Ukraine to use it against the other. But I still believe strongly, as we saw as reflected in the recent vote in Congress, that there's still strong bipartisan support in the U.S. for supporting Ukraine. And I think if Trump were to win, and that's a big if, I'm not in the political analysis arena, nor am I predicting anything here, but were he to win, I'm confident that enough people would say, look, Mr. President, you can't be the person that goes down in history losing to Putin in Ukraine, and then having on your hands the rest of Europe, or at least Eastern Europe, falling under direct Russian domination, if not finding themselves at war as well.
Oh, Mark, if the worst happens, I'm sure that Donald Trump would present it as his great success, but right. that's a different topic.
So, looking at the results of the latest European elections, do you think that they might somewhat impact the security of the eastern flank of NATO?
It remains to be seen. Obviously, a lot of what this new bloc can do as a result of the European elections is non-binding. You just reported on here in TVP World. I think for me personally, the thing that I would caution, is someone that looks at national security issues and military affairs, is I think it would be wise for Europe to start stepping back and realizing something bigger is at play here. We're starting to see the effects of Putin's weaponization of immigration, for instance, affecting your own domestic elections. Immigration, it seems to me, from a distant observer, looking at what drove this election and its results, played a big factor. You've got a strong disagreement between just how much immigration Europe should be allowing. And Putin gets that. He's weaponized it. You know that. In Poland in particular, because you've watched as Belarus has tried to, get various migrant groups to invade Poland, cross your borders, creating problems for your border guards and the like. Russian state propagandists have done the same in terms of targeting Finland and trying to create that same kind of mischief along their borders. And Romania and others could likely see the same thing. So I think it's important for us to step back as we look at this and we try to digest what these elections mean, is don't lose sight about who's behind some of this, who's manipulating it. And one of those factors is the immigration side that I strongly believe is being flared up, if you will, by Putin. Now, certainly let me be clear, the internal concern is very real, and I'm not discounting that. I think there are a lot of people in France, having seen the riots that have occurred there, in Belgium, in Germany, that are very troubled by, even in Sweden, for instance, that are very troubled by what migration has brought with the recent Palestinian protests. And I think that's significant. So there's two factors there. But I think at the end of the day, European security overall, immigration is an important factor to it. But it's going to take Europe defending itself against Putin if it truly wants to be secure going forward in the future.
Right. Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda said today at the meeting in Riga that, to quote, "We need to abolish red lines." And he also stated that the Bucharest Nine is united. But is it really united about this particular thing? I mean, the use of NATO-made weapons on the Russian territory, because the Bucharest Nine also has such members as Hungary and Slovakia.
Right. Machi, as you know, because we've talked about it before, you and I agree. The red lines have to go. It's crazy. You can't win a war if you keep tying your hands. I know out in the Wall Street Journal earlier today, there's a report that basically, I apologize, I meant at the ISW, the Institute for Study of War, they had a report out that basically Ukraine is allowed to attack 16% of Russian forces that are immediately affecting the front lines in the battlefield by withdrawing or not allowing them to use the long-range ATACMS. That leaves Russia in 84% of that territory free for them to create sanctuary for the forces, to mass them further back in order to be able to ultimately affect the close fight in Avdiivka and Kupiansk, in and around Kharkiv and the like. And that's just crazy. That red line needs to go. And I think, certainly the Bucharest Nine, making that statement is a positive one. But in all honesty, and in all candor, I feel like that change in policy needs to be brought about out of Washington. The White House has got to get on board with that. And unfortunately, I wish I had better news. I don't see this administration under Jake Sullivan's guidance doing that just yet. I think we're still seeing more of the same. This fear of escalation is causing them not to really give in and saying, let's get rid of those red lines, but actually keep them in place. To the extent that Eastern Europe can keep leading on that the Bucharest Nine can be saying this is nonsense, we need to eliminate them, that's great. But just quickly to bring up the point that you raised, Orban is a problem. And I think whether it's the Bucharest Nine is an individual group or bloc, or NATO is going to have to figure out how to start running Orban, because he's not being helpful. He's playing a double game. Some of it is just, what I call the Hungarian bazaar, that he's just trying to get concessions money, et cetera, out of the rest of Europe for himself. But some of it is just extremism not extremism, some of it's just opportunism, where he wants to know that he's got a fairly decent relationship with Russia the day after the war ends. And I think some of what we see out of him is just trying to placate Putin so that he can say, look, I wasn't so bad. I had your back, even though I had to do X, Y, and Z just to be able to stay in NATO. It's time for the Bucharest Nine to see past that. It's time for NATO to see past that. Orban is a problem.
As we read earlier today, when we were reading the news about the meeting taking place in Riga, the Bucharest Nine strongly supports the notion of enlarging NATO and adding Ukraine to the mix. Considering that there is a no-go from the U.S., do you think that this is a likely scenario at any point in time?
Claudia, probably not. It's a great question. Actually, the last time that I was on TVP World, we talked about just that. Why suddenly the Biden administration, Biden himself, seems to have reversed himself. And it just makes no sense because, behind the scenes, I know officials have been reporting, wait a minute, that's not the U.S. lying. That's not what the U.S. is telling us behind the scenes. They support Ukraine and NATO. But clearly in that Time Inc. interview, and I kind of broke it out, I spoke with Marie and Don on a particular program here on TVP World. I broke it down where to say, but if you look at what he was saying, he is against it, and that makes no sense. And that is a sudden reversal. You had Secretary Antony Blinken just earlier in April saying we support, a bridge for Ukraine joining NATO. You had Lloyd Austin saying it last year that after the war, Ukraine's place is in NATO. So none of this makes sense. This sudden reversal, except that Biden, in my mind, led by Jake Sullivan, is probably trying to send some kind of message to Putin that he wants to effect a negotiated end to this. Now, the problem is, I don't think Putin's going to buy that. Putin, in his mind, rightly or wrongly, thinks he's winning. And Ukraine, the biggest person that's going to have to sign off on this, they're not ready. They're not going to concede any of this. So it's just kind of madness that we're going down that path. And I'll just add, in my mind, Ukraine has already earned everything that you can possibly earn to get into NATO. I think if we look at D-Day and the celebrations that happened there to mark the 80th anniversary, and just Zelensky, bowing down to that American D-Day veteran, if you will, it tells you everything about the fight that Ukraine is in. You have an American hero, someone that represents our country's still finest generation, basically saying, look, you're the person that's saving us, saving Europe again. I think it's important that we take heed of that, and that Ukraine has earned that spot. They belong in NATO. Poland gets that. The Eastern European countries get that. It's time the White House gets it.
Mm-hmm. Mark, lastly, I'd like to ask you about the principles of the Bucharest Nine, because obviously the countries of the eastern flank of NATO are fortifying themselves now against any land invasion from Russia, but they are also countries that have a seashore at the Black Sea. Therefore, my question is, what makes us so sure that the conflict would actually happen in the Suwałki Gap? Could it also be, could it also happen at the Black Sea?
Yeah, Maciej, it's a great question. In war, you should be prepared for all possibilities. You can't just look at it as just a Suwałki Gap. I do know people like General Hodges, General Mark Hartling, people that have actually led the U.S. Army in Europe and had that command. The Suwałki Gap is what's concerned them the most. And certainly in the Baltic Sea, for instance, Finland and Sweden joining NATO now is a huge thing and helps safeguard what could have been a threat coming from, whether it was from St. Petersburg through the Baltic Sea or Kaliningrad, the exclave itself. Obviously, Russia still has tactical nukes in Kaliningrad that could be a factor. But certainly, the Black Sea is one other avenue in. For now, at least, though, Ukraine has kind of proven that Putin's navy is feckless, right? So how does he inject those forces into through the Black Sea? Through someplace like Moldova, into Romania, into that southern belly, if you will, of Eastern Europe. I think that's a heavy lift for him. But you want to be prepared for any of it, right? Anything can happen. Putin is in the process of reconstituting his military. He has rebuilt it in terms of production-wise. He's not yet rebuilt it in terms of personnel required, trained NCOs, trained, squad leaders, brigade leaders, and the like. He's got a lot to do to build that all back, probably a 2 to 3 year process, into a professional army again that could be a threat to NATO. But I think the Bucharest Nine really does need to look at it as one cohesive line and be prepared for everyone. And I'd only end here as we draw close to the hour mark, that you can't just look at it in terms of a defensive line. As I've mentioned on TVP World, it's going to be critical key that you have a counterstrike. You don't want these defensive lines, the Eastern Shield that you're building in Poland along with your Baltic allies. You don't want that to be your first line of defense. You want that to be your last ditch line of effect. So you're going to need the capability to counterstrike should Russia decide to attack, or Belarus in partnership with Russia decide to attack. You've got to have some offensive bite. And I think that's something that if I were advising the Bucharest Nine to be looking at, not just defensively, how to defend and stop Russia, but how to prevent them from getting close should they start to mass on your borders the same way that they did in Ukraine. You don't want to wait for them to make the first move and be put at a disadvantage.
Makes sense.
It does indeed. And a final question for you, Mark. We know that the representatives of Slovakia and Hungary were missing from the Bucharest 9 meeting. Some would consider this to be a chink in the armor. What does that mean for the security of the region?
Especially Slovakia.
Yeah, Claudia, it is, I think we're all troubled by what we've seen from Slovakia of late, especially, since Fico had taken over and this shift to what I would call a pro-Russian stance. I'd even bring up Serbia in connection to that. I mean, obviously Serbia was already pro-Russian, but the machinations going on there. And then you've got Orban. I mean, you always need to be concerned about that. And even recent elections in the Netherlands, which don't have an effect yet in terms of any decision making, but still, you're getting elements that tend to be more pro-Putin. I think it's problematic, but I think that's also why it's just critical for the leaders of the Bucharest 9, for Poland in particular. I think is kind of, you are the heart, in my mind, of Eastern Europe, in addition to Ukraine, obviously. But right now, Ukraine has its hands full. So in my mind, Poland really is the heart of making sure everyone remains on the same page, and that page is all about pushing back against Putin and not falling for what a Fico or Orban or, basically Slovakia and Hungary might take you down. You need to keep that leadership role. You need to, You need to keep your eye on the ball, which is keeping everyone in line as much as possible, to acknowledging that Putin is the biggest existential threat that you face.
Security and foreign policy expert Mark Toth was our guest tonight. Thank you very much, Mark.
Always a pleasure, Claudia. Machi. Take care.
Thank you.